Aleister Crowley was a poet, mystic, and provocateur, but what if that was only the mask? What if behind the rituals, the scandal, and the shadows, he was playing a far more dangerous game, namely that of a British spy? Let's explore the intersection between secret societies and spy networks here on Things Visible and Invisible. Dr. Richard Spence is an historian and professor emeritus at the University of Idaho, known for his deep research into espionage, secret societies, and the occult. He's the author of a number of books, including Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. And he joins me down the line from his home in Idaho. Rich, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Well, I'm glad to be on. Thank you.
Now, when I first came across your work, Rich, I was sort of scratching my head wondering, is there really anything more to be said about Mr. Crowley? He's been mythologized and talked about and used in every sort of mass media that we can think about. Is this really the sort of untold story of his services to the British Empire?
Well, there's certainly a lot to be told about anybody, you know. Human lives are extraordinarily deep and complicated things, and that goes for just about anyone. You know, it's the old saying, do you really know anybody? You think you do, and then you find something that they had a whole life before that you weren't aware of. Sometimes you're married to them. So Crowley, the key word you used there, I think, was mythologized, which means that Crowley, his persona and his life, his works have become encrusted with barnacles, in a sense, that a whole variety of the stories accumulate, and some of those have some kind of basis in fact, and others don't. And so I suppose you could argue that my contribution, if there is one, to the ever-expanding Crowleyverse was his connection to British intelligence. And some people, that's a kind of shocking idea because it seems to be completely out of character for him. You know, one of the reasons being is that here is someone who, well, let's start for a moment in terms of who Aleister Crowley was. Some people may be very familiar with him, or at least familiar with the myths. Other people may never have heard of him before. I don't know how that happened, but maybe you haven't. So Aleister Crowley today is generally regarded as the arch occultist of the 20th century. I suppose of the 21st so far. He is often called a Satanist. He has been dubbed the wickedest man in the world, a man we'd like to hang, an arch scoundrel. I mean, you can pick just about any kind of negative term, and that has been applied to him. Now, on the other hand, if that was the way he was often portrayed and viewed and categorized in, let's say, normal society, to his admirers, to his fans, even to his followers, of which there have always been some, and maybe now more than others, he's a kind of heroic figure. He's almost a Luciferian figure, someone who rebelled against the morality and false conventions of Victorian and Edwardian society, who tried to break free of all of these kinds of restraints. A liberating figure. A kind of Prometheus, some have called it. Now, that's adding a lot to it. How do you reconcile those two things? I mean, between the Promethean or Luciferian heroic figure of liberation and rebellion, as opposed to simply a foul, despicable character, a satanic presence.
Yes. Well,
go ahead.
Let me just ask about that, Rich, because one of the thing that surprised me really in coming across your research is just the sort of image that you've alluded to. in terms of Crowley, as somebody who was involved with various sort of the esoteric revival, I guess, the occult revival of the late 19th century into the early 20th century, somebody who was very much international in his outlook. He was traveling all over the place, but he was essentially somebody who was, for want of a better expression, lost in his own mystical realms. He didn't seem to sort of inhabit the ordinary world that most of us lived in. So in some ways, whenever I heard about British intelligence, I really began to wonder what use would this kind of mystical dreamer be to an intelligence unit anywhere that needed somebody who was, shall we say, on top of their game. We also know that from a very early age, Crowley was dabbling in all sorts of narcotics of one sort or another, which again would seem to suggest that he wasn't probably the most reliable of people. How would you sort of counter those sort of maybe stereotypes, maybe misconceptions that we have of him prior to the First World War?
Well, one simple answer might be is that intelligence agencies make use of people simply because they are useful. So this would be to argue that intelligence agencies just would never hire anybody who had questionable moral habits or dabbled in drugs. I mean, I could almost assure you that any number of drug addicts have been employed in one form or another in an intelligence capacity because they're useful at some particular point in time. It's never about, in many cases, liking people or even trusting them. In some cases, the most fundamental thing you know about a person is that they are untrustworthy, that you can't trust them. But those people can still be useful. I mean, the point out, you never start out with the illusion that you can trust them. You know they'll sell you out the first chance you got, but in the meantime, you can use them for their purposes. A simpler way to put it is that would British intelligence or any other agency ever possibly employ the uses of someone who might be described as evil? Yes, they absolutely would if it accomplished their particular ends, and they would dispose of them just as quickly. But let's go back to a question here about this difference between the kind of Luciferian figure and the satanic figure. I don't know, aren't this the same thing? Well, some would argue no. What's in between there? What's in between is simply Crowley, the man, because that's most obviously what he is. He is a simple human being, which is to say that he is a complicated one. But let me add this. There are, and there always were, as he was alive, two Crowleys, never one. There is the Crowley that he was born, which was Edward Alexander Crowley. That's his actual name. He is named after his father, who was a lay minister in a regular Protestant sect called the Plymouth Brethren. Now, one of the ways to maybe get an insight into Crowley is that the interesting thing to think of is the most notorious occultist of the 20th century was raised in what we would today describe as a Christian fundamentalist household. That's what his environment was. He didn't grow up surrounded, his mother wasn't a witch and they weren't surrounded by black cauldrons and grimoires. No, they were surrounded by hellfire and brimstone preaching. So in some ways, Aleister Crowley becomes, to me, one of the prime examples of at least what here in the States was sometimes called the preacher kid syndrome, which is to say that the offspring of preachers or religious figures, I mean, not always, but seem to be noted for often going bad, so to speak, or becoming rebellious. That the strictures and the expectations about being a preacher's kid just sort of drive them wild. Certainly this was a fellow who defied the expectations you might have for his upbringing. But he is, and he always is, because he never legally changes his name. To his dying day, he is Edward Aleister Crowley. And if you look at his passports and most of the legal documents concerning him, his actions of what could be called the real world, that's who he is. So you might argue, well, so what? He sort of adopted this name. Well, Aleister Crowley. Aleister is his fancy adaptation of his middle name, Alexander. He liked it better. That, in some ways, almost, I think, was an act of teenage rebellion. But it was his way of sort of creating, I think, an identity for himself that was separate from his father's. Even though his father dies when he's quite young. I think he dies when Crowley is around 11. So it's not like they had a long time together. He was never spent most of his life under his father's shadow. But it's also something like this. Aleister Crowley is, in effect, a stage name.
Right.
It's, yeah.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. So what you're talking about is essentially a sort of persona, I suppose.
No, he creates his own kind of persona, but he never ceases to be the person that he originally was. So there's a kind of...
So, Rich,
Aleister Crowley, in some ways, I think, is a kind of alter ego of Eddie Crowley, which is what some of his early friends called it.
So what you're suggesting almost, Rich, is that there's kind of two Crowleys. There's the regular Edward, who is probably as sensible in some ways as his family were. And then there's the Aleister, which is the stage name, the stage persona, the outward-looking creation, which the media and the tabloids of its day had a field day with. Is that too simplistic a way of thinking around him going forward in this?
Well, I think it gets us maybe closer to what the truth is. I mean, only he would understand what the connection between these two sides of himself were. I mean, there are some people who've accused me of saying that Aleister Crowley was an act, that's all that it ever was. It was, again, it's a kind of stage persona that he creates for himself. Keep in mind, people do this all the time. Okay, this is extraordinarily common in the arts or in performing, acting. People will assume a name and create a persona for themselves, while at the same time, in their private life, they're Eddie or Donna or whatever the case might be. I think it's something like that. All of us, I think it's fair to say, to one degree or another, create a persona that we project to others, which is not quite the same as the persona that we sort of guard within ourselves.
Yeah.
So I think, as one person put it, I can identify with this. What's the real you? Is the real you the one which is kind of you deal with the outside world? Or is it the you that's there when it's just you and your dog? All right. So I think we'd all recognize the fact when it's just us and our dog, or us and our cat, or your parrot, or whatever it might be, that's a different kind of you. But Crowley wanted to create this kind of flamboyant, personal identity for himself, which he was eventually quite successful at, but which didn't really get him the results that he wanted. I mean, you ever heard the idea that if you play a role long enough, the role begins to play you?
Yeah.
That's what happened to him. And so initially the idea, I think, of being called the wickedest man in the world, of clearly offending the sensibilities of a society whose morals you had nothing but contempt for, well, that was kind of cool, And you might argue it's kind of an adolescent thing in this case, but the fact that you had angered and offended the people that you wanted to anger and offend could be seen as a kind of accomplishment. But then what happens is that this negative persona becomes one that eventually you can't throw off. It is a stink which never goes away. And you realize that people will never perceive you as anything other than that. I mean, there was an example of this in the early 1930s, and Crowley was trying to redeem his reputation. He had finally come back to England after spending years effectively in exile, living in the continent, in France, and then Germany. And, one of the things that would always happen whenever he would come home is that he would be hounded by the press. The press would go back to his World War I, which antics which were treasonous. There's no question about that. And began calling him names and trying to dredge up the past. So he wanted to do some. So what had happened is that a woman, I think by the name of Nina Hamnet, published a book in which she included stories about him and his activities in Sicily, which were partly true, but which also included allegations of everything, I think, these sort of Epstein-like allegations of magic rituals and baby eating that were not true, and he knew they weren't true. They were gross exaggerations. They were libel. And so he sued her. Now, the thing is that what she was saying were lies. She was not telling the true story. But what her defense did, their only defense, was to simply direct the court to his reputation. And that's then what happened. He ended up on trial. His reputation as the wickedest man in the world was used against him, and he lost the case. A result of which, by the way, is that he became bankrupt and remained an undischarged bankrupt until the end of his life in 1947. So even in trying to use the truth to redeem his reputation, he found that reputation, that negative reputation, was so powerful that it even obscured the truth.
Right. So that's fascinating, Rich, and a very, very good oversight of a different side to Crowley. Maybe maybe he's a slightly sort of pathetic or a figure full of pathos rather than the evil that many ascribe to him. However, I want to go back to the substance of your book, which is how he got involved with British intelligence. When do you think the first contact was made between intelligence services and Crowley?
The most likely initial contact was when he was at Cambridge. He didn't graduate. He was there for a while.
What year are we talking?
He talks about wanting to, early on, he wanted to go into the diplomatic service. Didn't do that. Here's a fellow who had opportunities. He didn't come from a particularly wealthy family, but wealthy enough that had he had any kind of financial sense, any kind of financial probity, he probably could have squandered a reasonable family fortune. He could have lived a nice dissolute life if that's what he wanted to, but he didn't. The management of money was not one of his talents. It seems to me pretty much that if any money came into his hands, he was one of those people who simply spent it until it was gone and then sat around waiting for someone to give him more, the next check to show up. I've known lots of people like that. So that's one of the problems he often had in terms of friendships and associations, is that he was constantly bumming money off of people and seldom have ever paid it back. That wasn't a big concern for him in some ways. You could say that maybe his eyes were on something more lofty, on spiritual enlightenment, and so the mere act of money grubbing was kind of unimportant, and yet it was. So I think that began early on, but it's one of these things which is kind of intermittent. So maybe we get some terminology here. One shouldn't think of Aleister Crowley in his relationship with British intelligence as being some kind of officer, of being some sort of James Bond, of being someone who is a regular employee. Those people exist. But what intelligence work is really based upon is the collection of assets. Those people who are useful, those people who have contacts, information, skills that are useful. They are, in a sense, occasional employees. I mean, maybe they get paid, maybe they don't. Maybe there's some other form of compensation. But early on, he was probably, for some of those mysterious reasons, seen as a young man with potential. And one of those potentials might have been, well, one of the things that might have been attractive was his early indifference to moral norms. Now, the mere fact that he wasn't well behaved and that he didn't necessarily adhere to normal societal behavior. Because one of the things that you might be required to do, well, I think it was Jean Le Carré, Orwell, who talking about his recruitment at university into intelligence was told early on is that, well, if you're going to go into this line of work, there are two things that you're going to have to be prepared to do. You're going to have to lie, and you're going to have to kill. I mean, that may never come up, but you will have to do it, and you will have to do it without thinking about it. Now, a lot of people would have problems with that. That's why everybody wouldn't be suitable for that work. Mm-hmm. And therefore, a person who's, let's say, whose moral spectrum is broader than most others. Well, simply put, somebody who wouldn't necessarily have a problem with lying and killing, well, that doesn't disqualify from the work. That's an advantage. That's exactly the type of person that one might want to have, a person who could deceive. So I became acquainted. I guess one of the questions might be is that, well, how did I ever come across this? Back in the 1990s, I was researching another spy entirely, a fellow by the name of Sidney Riley, which might come across, and we're not going to go any further into him. But Riley was active in New York during the First World War, and he also had some kind of interaction with British intelligence there. And I knew the claims that Crowley later made. Periodically, he would, sort of under pressure, he'd go that, well, I know that everybody says that I was a traitor during the war, but actually I was working for His Majesty's government. And so he'd make these claims that he had actually been doing patriotic work during the war, even though apparently as a traitor. I don't think nobody at the time took those claims very seriously. And at that time, I never even came across any avowed fans of Aleister Crowley who tended to believe that. Now, that sounded like something he'd come up with years later to kind of try to whitewash his bad behavior.
Can you just...
But I was kind of interested...
Just before we get into that, can you outline what the official idea of his treachery was? What was he accused of during the First World War?
Well, so what did Aleister Crowley do that was during the First World War that was so bad? They got him dubbed the man we'd like to hang, and dubbed a traitor. Shortly after the war broke out, in fact, on Halloween, on October 31st, 1914, he arrived in New York aboard the Lusitania. Now, some people make something significant out of that. I don't know. It's interesting. Aleister Crowley, on Halloween, comes to New York aboard a doomed ship, not for some months, but a ship that will eventually, go down, literally, in infamy. So what he did after arriving there was that he styled himself a Fenian. He styled himself an Irish nationalist revolutionary, even though he'd never shown much interest in that beforehand. His connections to Ireland itself seemed to be nil. And he would go through, he then not long after that actually did a kind of public demonstration under the eyes of the Statue of Liberty. He brought a group of people out there. Somebody played the fiddle while he stood up, gave an anti-British speech, tore up what was supposed to be his British passport, and proclaimed war against the British Empire in the name of Ireland. And by the way, he made sure that there was a New York Times reporter there in order to record this and write about it the next day. Now, see, that tells you something. This was not a kind of accidental occurrence. This was a dog and pony show that Crowley put together and made sure there was a reporter who would then write about it and it would be publicized. Now, that's not the only limit to the fakery involved in that. The document that supposedly was his passport, now his real passport was back home, perfectly safe in his hotel. He still had it in 1919 because he had to replace it. So what it was just, a bunch of old papers he put into an envelope. So here again is Aleister Crowley, performing an act in public to create a false impression as to who he was and to what his loyalties actually were. So he then, through this, he manages to, who does he attract the attention of by these kind of antics? Well, remember, the United States, through most of the First World War, is a neutral country. There's a lot of competition behind the scenes to try to keep the country out of the war or bring it in. The Germans wanted to keep America out. The British very much wanted to bring it in and worked actively in order to achieve that successfully. And so Crowley mostly impressed the German propaganda. And the Germans did have their own sort of propaganda cabinet in New York, how to manage American public opinion. And he went to work for a German-American journalist by the name of George Sylvester Viereck. And Viereck published a magazine in New York, the English edition of which was called The Fatherland, Der Vaterland in German. Because if you're going to publish a pro-German magazine, I guess that's pretty much what you would have called it. And the Fatherland, sought to influence American public opinion, or at least German-American public opinion, to the righteousness of the cause of the Kaiser and all of the terrible things that perfidious Albion was doing. And Crowley used his literary talents, which were not insubstantial. He was a great satirist, in order to write what were blatantly anti-British articles. I mean, he did everything from personally insulting the king to talking about the glories of Zeppelin raids raining fire over London. I mean, those were all things that after the war, you might assume if you'd done it, would be very difficult to explain. Which, skipping ahead a bit, I would add that he was never asked to do, which is kind of interesting. I mean, British officialdom never had any problem with that. Well, anyway, I said I was trying to figure out whether there was some sort of connection between Riley's activities and Crowley's just because of their presence in the same place at the same time. So I wrote off to the U.S. National Archives to see if there was anything in the files of what's called the Military Intelligence Division about Crowley. Now, at the time, this is 1918, the FBI as it exists today wasn't really around. It was only a rudimentary organization. So most American, let's say, national security was in the hands of the U.S. Army's Intelligence Division, the MID. And they created this, well, to no surprise, created this whole huge network of informants and information gathering and files. So I knew that they collected files on people doing all sorts of things. And so I wrote off, and I sure enough, a little file showed up. It wasn't very long. Most of it wasn't terribly interesting. But there was one page that included this, and I will read it. The Americans were concerned about Crowley because they knew that, they're now in the war, so they're extremely suspicious of anybody who'd been writing German propaganda before. And they note that Crowley had been formally investigated by the Department of Justice on the charge of being a German spy. They, in fact, were considering arresting him. It goes on to state that it was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government at present in this country on official business, of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. It was found that the British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with this German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. What did the consulate tell them? We don't have any problem with this. He's doing something for us. Notice the fact that what his official mission is was never identified. He's in the country on some kind of official mission, and during that time, he's written anti-British propaganda and basically leave him alone. So that was my whole start. Now, I have to admit that when I got this file, I was going to assume that Crowley's claims were either false or entirely exaggerated. So I was surprised to find this because it meant that when Crowley later claimed I was doing official work for the British government in New York during World War I, he was telling the truth. The question then remained, through the research, to figure out what that unstated official work was.
Absolutely fascinating. So, I mean, just to, are we talking then ultimately about Crowley in New York, with this masquerading as an anti-British agitator, when all the time he was infiltrating whatever the German spy networks were in New York at the time? Is that what we're suggesting here?
Yes, I mean, that's essentially what his mission would have been. He gained the confidence of the Germans by posing as an Irish rebel. Yeah, the curious thing to me was I wasn't really sure how the question to me was, how gullible were the Germans? Why would they take his word for anything?
Exactly.
Because the Germans, by the way, were cooperating on every level they could with the Irish nationalists. I don't think it's any great mystery that the United States had been a hotbed for Irish nationalist agitation, Fenian agitation as it was then called, for decades. And the Germans were certainly cooperating with them, but I don't find that among the Irish in New York that Crowley had any sort of, nobody seems to have taken any particular interest in him. They don't seem to have known what to make of him because he had no past association with it. So the question for me was how there had to be something else to give him credibility with the Germans. Someone, somewhere in that process, had to vouch for him. Mm-hmm. Now that, I think, is where the occult connections come in. Because one of the things that you find, if you go back a few years before the war, if you go back to around 1910, 1911, you find out that Crowley was initiated into a German occult society, a thing called the Ordo Templi Orientis. It's still very much around today and associated with Crowley, but it was in this period, it was a German occult secret society. And the man who initiated him into that secret society was a German by the name of Theodor Reuss. And Reuss had worked in Britain before the war. He'd done everything from running a kind of news service. He was a reporter. He also apparently had some connection to a kind of labor association of German waiters. I never knew that there were many German waiters in London in that period, but apparently they had their own sort of association, and he was the head, or at least an influence within that, and then also was a journalist. Of course, when you say journalist, what do you mean? You mean somebody whose job is collecting and conveying information. So, no big surprise. You can probably figure out what's coming. What else with Theodor Reuss? He was a German intelligence officer. And during the war, he would go to work full time for German intelligence. That's what he was doing in England before the war. He was running a spy ring.
Right.
So you've got a German intelligence officer who's running a spy ring, partly based around German waiters in restaurants. They hear things. And this is the guy who initiates Aleister Crowley into this German Ordo Templi Orientis. In doing so, I believe, Reuss thought that he was co-opting Crowley into his organization, into German intelligence itself. Again, as a guy who might be useful. Someone who didn't seem to be outwardly too loyal to his government, and someone who later on became useful. And this is what I think happened. Someone in New York, among the Germans in New York, checked back in Berlin, and they checked with Theodor Reuss, and Theodor Reuss said, he's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So his very connection to an occult order is the thing that gave him credibility for his work. And then, Crowley would later argue that, well, all those articles I wrote for the Fatherland, they were parodies. I mean, they were they were so over the top. His way of putting it is that only Germans would take it seriously. I don't know whether that's true, but that's his way of looking at it. This is the type of thing that would it was the type of thing that they were expecting him to say, but that, remember, what a lot of this was supposed to be influencing was the American public. And it didn't have the same kind of impact there. Here's what Crowley told his German colleagues in New York was the best way to influence Americans. He said, Americans are a childlike people. They are immature. They are not acquainted with the rough rules of the world, and therefore they are easily intimidated. And therefore, Germany was present itself as a hard and, you need to scare them. That's what you need to do. You want to keep the Americans out of the war? You scare them as to how horrible a war with Germany would be. And therefore, you don't try to appeal with reason or nice that. You just try to scare them because they're really just children. Now, whatever truth there might be in that, the thing is that, it did not work out in that direction. But the Germans did, again, seem to buy it in some respects. So what he did was to insinuate himself into the German propaganda apparatus and then lead them in the wrong direction. It's the very thing that he was supposed to do, and he accomplished that quite well. Now,
But
when the war is over, he doesn't come home right away.
Sorry, Rich, if I could just ask, I mean, this is a very interesting kind of scenario that you're presenting here, but it's also begging the question that German intelligence networks and spy masters were not as acutely aware of maybe Crowley as a double agent figure. I mean, was there a way in which maybe the Germans were also aware of this and were kind of allowing him to play along with this, because maybe his actual impact on America for the British cause was limited?
Well, he seemed to think that his influence in the British cause was, he thought, was somehow substantial. For instance, one of the things that Crowley kept, one of the things that it's an important source of information about him, was his personal diary. He's always writing down everything that he does. Sometimes in a kind of code, he becomes cryptic about certain people and places, which I think is kind of interesting. But Shortly after, I don't know, he's in some hotel in New Orleans or someplace, and he's read in the newspapers, this is in early 1917, that the United States has severed diplomatic relations with Germany. Now, this is sometimes before the war comes along, but it's clearly that war is coming. And to himself, in effect, he's not boasting to anybody else. He's saying that, well, my work has sort of, I've been part. I give myself sort of credit for this. I've helped bring this about. Now, I don't know. He could have been exaggerating it. Probably was. But he still saw that what he was doing was a part of this process. And this was part of there was a much larger British intelligence operation in wartime New York beginning around 1916, spearheaded by a fellow by the name of Sir William Wiseman, who had been a British officer who had been invalided out of the war and then sent to take over what would later be called the MI6. It wasn't called that then, office there. Crowley isn't actually connected to that, but Wiseman's job, his secret primary job, is to bring the United States into the war on Britain's side. Not, interestingly enough, the term is never put on the Allies' side, but on Britain's side. And he does fairly accomplish that. And Wiseman accomplishes it by getting an introduction to Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, and going in and out of the White House on a regular basis. That's another story entirely. But, the U.S. entry into the war wasn't one of those things that just somehow happened. It was the combination of a lot of things, and one of the things that's an important part of this was a definite, coherent British intelligence plan to bring that end about.
Mm-hmm.
Crowley, in his way of corrupting German propaganda, if it needed that, from his standpoint, I don't think he's necessarily completely off base in saying that he played at least some contributing role in it. Now, the other thing he may have done is that, you're talking about his, it comes back to this question of why would the Germans take him seriously? I think in the process of corrupting the propaganda issue, he also perhaps recruited some Germans as double agents. One of those, I suspect, is George Sylvester Viereck himself. That is, did Crowley find ways to compromise them? One of the things that Crowley was involved in, well, you mentioned it earlier, is that he was an avid partaker of drugs for both ritual and recreational purposes. Apparently, his favorite recreational drug was ether. So, not too popular today, which to me always seems like just one tiny step above huffing gas. But nevertheless, that in terms of drugs that he enjoyed, that seems to have been the main one. But others he used for more, well, often, mind-expanding ritual purposes. And the key one of those, I suppose, was what would they call mescaline, peyote, magic mushrooms. And one of the things that had been done around 1915 by the American Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company is that they were the first that I know of to synthesize the active ingredient from the peyote cactus. And so basically you got mescaline. They produced that in their lab in Detroit, and Crowley, on one of his cross-country trips, passed through Detroit and bought a pound paper bag of mescaline. I want you to imagine that. You just walk into the place and you buy a pound paper bag of mescaline. No real controls at that time. And over the course of the next few years, he uses most of that in rituals for recreational purposes, but also for other things. Here's something sort of interesting. Crowley would invite people over for a dinner, and he would often prepare something like, he would talk about a spicy curry or some sort of more exotic dish, which strange tastes might not be noticeable. And he would then carefully record how much mescaline he would put into the food. And then he would also note the age, gender, approximate size, and weight of his dinner guests. And then, presumably not consuming the food himself, he would feed it to them and then sit back and record what happened. This is a kind of scientist at work. So what he was doing is taking a psychoactive drug and turning his dinner guests into guinea pigs to see exactly what it did. Now, was he doing that for his own amusement? Maybe, was this sort of a practical joke he was playing? And he wrote most of this stuff up. There was one of the volumes of his works, which was dubbed the Cactus. There you go. And which has subsequently, as far as I know, completely disappeared from surviving Crowley manuscripts. It seems to have been last recorded as being around in 1919, and he apparently brought it back to England with him when he returned in 1919, and it's never been seen again. Now, an interesting detail, which may or may not mean anything, I think it means something, is that in the years later on, if we go into even to the 1920s and 30s, certainly into the 1950s, into the psychedelic drug research of groups like the CIA, you find that one of the drugs that they're really, really interested in is mescaline. Alongside LSD. This is what is it that, the CIA's MK Ultra, and I'm sure British intelligence had its own aspect of this. What are they doing? They're getting guinea pigs together, and they're dosing them with mescaline and LSD and other substances, and they're seeing how they react and how this might possibly be used for intelligence purposes.
Right.
So, when Crowley, back in World War I, was dosing his dinner guests with mescaline, was that just a practical joke, or was it practical intelligence research? I'm not sure, but I wonder.
We're going to have to conclude our discussions here, but what you have done, Rich, is give us a lot of food for thought, no pun intended, as to who and what the real Aleister Crowley was in New York during the First World War. For people to find out more, they're going to have to go and read your book. So tell people where they can find out more about you and also pick up a copy of Agent 666.
Secret Agent 666, a title I chose because it was the best title I could think of, should be available through Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, any other sort of online bookseller. It is still actively in print and hopefully will be for some time. I do anticipate doing a revised edition, maybe a couple of years down the road. But there are and you can find my other books, my biography of Riley, Trust No One would be available, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, about all kinds of, guess what, financial skullduggery. And the other things that I would, the more recent work that I might want to mention is that there is a company called The Great Courses. You can go online and find them, The Great Courses. And I have done for them, I think, 5 courses now. One is The Real History of Secret Societies, which again pretty much include everything. Every course I've done includes something on Aleister Crowley. So that's The Real History of Secret Society, Secrets of the Occult, which has a whole episode on Crowley. Of course, Crimes of the Century, recently Great Villains of History. Those are all things that you might want to check out. I also have, in my own humble way, a friend and I have a podcast called Strange as It Seems. You have to say Strange as It Seems podcast, available on YouTube, Spotify, and other platforms. And again, we do have an episode on Crowley there as well, among many other things. So that's my stuff.
For now, Rich, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.